Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Nick Van Os. I'm an SEL Services Coordinator who works mostly at Tier 1 in the core. But FYI, most of my experience in education was at a special ed, behavior-focused Setting 4 program as a school psychologist, and at a Setting 7 program as a paraprofessional. That means I've worked with many high-intensity, high-needs students. Now let's get to the question on the slide. This is a fair question. I won't lie to you. This Basics of Behavior video is going to have a fair amount of scientific vocabulary in it. And I've done my best to make it digestible, but at some point you may be asking yourself, why does this matter? Why do I need to know this? Okay, number one, this is the scientific backbone of all the practices and the decisions we're making regarding student behavior. I'll repeat that because it's important. This is the scientific backbone. Behavior is something we're all doing all the time. With that experience comes attitudes and opinions, and conversations about behavior can get pretty abstract. You hear phrases like student-centered discipline, responsive classroom, restorative practices, trauma-informed practices, etc., etc. It's very helpful to be able to step back and frame things in terms of the basic foundational concepts you'll learn about in this video. You can always retreat back to that scientific backbone, and it will help you understand why something works or doesn't work. And number two, the more significant and complex the needs of the students you're working with, the more important it is to be fluent in these concepts and to even dive deeper than what I can cover in this video. Yes, this is still the scientific backbone of Tier 1 practices, Tier 2 practices, but when we get to Tier 3 and special education and we're looking at individual students who are really struggling, it's much harder to affect change in a positive way. We have much less room for error. If we're fluent in these backbone concepts, we're far more likely to design an effective intervention. Without these concepts, we can feel lost, like we're spinning our wheels, and we may even design an intervention that's counterproductive. So first, let's get really basic and talk about how behavior works. In this section, I'm going to share 3 points with you. And this is part 1 of 3 for this video, and FYI, this is the longest chunk of the video. Point number 1, behavior is relative. When we hear the word behavior in schools, often our minds automatically jump to bad behavior, as if the two terms are equivalent and interchangeable. In fact, a student smiling and pleasantly greeting his teacher is engaging in behavior every bit as much as another student shoving a peer on the playground. Behavior, the word, is expansive. It's anything a person says or does. So to communicate accurately then, we must add labels such as expected or unexpected behavior, appropriate or inappropriate behavior, desired or undesired behavior. These terms are used because the appropriateness of any behavior is in the eye of the beholder, and it's dependent on the situation. To illustrate that, the same behavior, for example shouting, can be undesirable in some situations, say in the soup aisle at the grocery store, but desirable in others, say on the football field during practice. Point number 2, behavior is predictable. Now, I'm not saying that we are fortune tellers who can see the future or read students' minds. No. This means that we can see meaningful patterns in behavior by looking at what tends to come before a behavior and what tends to happen afterward. Conditions or events that occur immediately prior to a behavior are what we call antecedents. This could be, for example, a worksheet being set on a student's desk, another student walking past them, a greeting from a teacher. It's whatever comes immediately before the behavior. Setting events, these are sometimes called slow triggers, are factors that make a behavior more or less likely to occur following the same triggering antecedent. For example, a student who slept 3 hours the night before and did not receive their anti-anxiety medication, when corrected by a teacher, may be more likely to respond with an undesired behavior than the same student if they had gotten a full night's sleep and received their anti-anxiety medication. In this example, the lack of sleep and medication did not directly trigger the behavior, but they may have contributed to the likelihood the student reacts with undesired behavior. That's what a setting event is, or a slow trigger. Following any behavior, there is a consequence. In schools, we tend to use the word consequence interchangeably with punishment. It's assumed that we mean a bad consequence. Now, let that go for a moment because consequence in these scientific terms is completely neutral. A consequence is any event that occurs immediately after the behavior. This includes intentional consequences, like ones we give to a student, but it also includes natural consequences. It could be, for example, someone smiling at the student, someone taking away a preferred item, or the student getting hurt. Let's detour into a helpful analogy from Dr. Clay Cook at the University of Minnesota. In this analogy, the lighter fluid is our setting event. It's not going to start the fire, but it makes it a heck of a lot more likely that a match is going to start a fire. The lit match is our triggering antecedent. It comes in the moment just before a behavior occurs. It's the direct trigger. In this analogy, the big blazing fire represents an undesired behavior, a behavior we don't want to occur. It could be shoving, it could be swearing, it could be shouting, etc. Finally, we have our consequence. Remember, this is a purely neutral term, consequence. It's just whatever comes after the behavior. In this case, we have brats, which is meant to represent a maintaining consequence. The behavior has been reinforced, meaning it's more likely to happen again in the future. I just mentioned that in our fire and brats analogy, the consequence happened to be a reinforcer. Consequences generally fall into the two categories of either reinforcement or punishment. Punishment, like consequences, is another example of a term that often has a negative connotation. You may hear people saying, for example, that their discipline program is non-punitive, as if punishment means that a student is going to be treated in an unfair or unhelpful way. Again, I need you to let go of that association for a moment. Punishment and reinforcement are both purely neutral terms that are exclusively 100% defined by the effect they have on behavior. If it makes a behavior more likely to happen again, then it's reinforcement. If it makes a behavior less likely to happen again, then it's punishment. That's all those terms mean. Looking at this graphic, the use of positive and negative might confuse you then. So let's break that down next. In life, we don't just like to obtain things that we like, we also like to avoid things that we do not like. Here, positive is referring to cases where something is being added, and negative is referring to something being removed. Positive reinforcement means that the consequence of my behavior is me obtaining or encountering something pleasant, something I enjoy. It makes my behavior more likely to occur again, or it keeps that likelihood the same. Negative reinforcement means that the consequence of my behavior is something aversive, something unpleasant for me, going away. It also makes my behavior more likely to occur again, or it keeps that likelihood the same. Positive punishment means that the consequence of my behavior is me encountering something aversive, something unpleasant. I don't like it. If that happens, it makes my behavior less likely to occur again. Negative punishment means that the consequence of my behavior is me losing something pleasant, something I like. It goes away. If that happens, it makes my behavior less likely to occur again. I mentioned before that consequences generally fall into the categories of reinforcement and punishment. That's because there is such a thing as neutral consequences that have no effect on behavior, by the way. The third point we're making about behavior, third and last, is that behavior is functional. When the consequence of a behavior is reinforcement, what we just talked about, the behavior is maintained, i.e., it's likely to happen again. We refer to these maintaining consequences as the functions of behavior. Those functions of behavior are what you can see here. The function of a behavior could be 1. Obtaining pleasant attention. 2. Avoiding or escaping aversive, unpleasant attention. 3, obtaining a pleasant activity. 4, avoiding or escaping an aversive, unpleasant activity. 5, obtaining a desired tangible object. And finally, we have automatic reinforcement, where we're either obtaining a pleasant sensory stimulus or escaping or avoiding an unpleasant sensory stimulus. You may hear automatic reinforcement referred to as non-social or self-stimulatory. The behavior itself is reinforcing. A good example is scratching an itchy mosquito bite. An important point to make here is that how functional a behavior is to a student is dependent on the individual student's preferences. For example, say that Trevor, Jerry, and Sam's teacher promises to reward the class with a pizza party if the average score on a test is a B. Trevor loves pizza. Jerry doesn't feel strongly about it, and Sam hates pizza. All other things being equal, we could say that studying behavior will be most functional for Trevor, and Trevor is the most likely to study hard for the test. Another important point to make is that these functions of behavior that I've described are based on what we can verify through observation, and therefore confirm as a certainty. The effect of a student's internal attitudes, intentions, etc., for example, wanting to be viewed as powerful or in control, cannot be confirmed through observation and are inherently subjective. In order to be 100% objective, we determine functions based only on the observable consequences of behavior. And that leads us to an FAQ. Question that sometimes gets asked is, what about power and control? Aren't they functions of behavior? Now, it can feel intuitive to observe an interaction and to infer that power and control are influencing the behavior of the people involved. Think, for example, of a pair of middle school boys who often play video games together. Whenever they disagree about what game to play, the larger boy punches the smaller boy on the arm and teases him. When this occurs, they end up playing the game preferred by the larger boy. Now, an observer might observe these interactions and report that the larger boy desires power and control over the smaller boy. We can't objectively measure power and control. We can't add or remove power and control. And consequently, it's not operational for us. We may choose to explain the behavior with it, but we can't operate on that explanation to design an effective intervention. We can, however, break it down and realize that the larger boy is obtaining access to a preferred activity. That access is likely the function of the larger boy's behavior, and we can add or remove access to that preferred activity, and therefore we can operate on our knowledge of the function and design an effective intervention based on it. Here's the big takeaway. We cannot infer intent. Consider what you know for a fact, what you can observe and measure. You can always break behavior down to deduce a function that's operational. Another FAQ. Here's a scenario that's been brought up in a training before. Say that my student, Norman, loves using a tablet computer and eating cookies, but whenever an adult offers him these things as reinforcers, he rejects them. Isn't the function of Norman's behavior to obtain power and control? We try to avoid jargon, but to really understand what's going on here, it does help to understand the concepts of establishing operations and abolishing operations. Establishing operations increase the current effectiveness of a stimulus, an object, or an activity as reinforcement. Abolishing operations decrease something's effectiveness as reinforcement. Establishing operations and abolishing operations are very similar to setting events, and the terms are often used interchangeably. Remember setting events, what we talked about earlier, slow triggers. To better understand how this works, let's talk about Brad, an anxious introvert who typically leaves parties fairly quickly. Because large social events are aversive and unpleasant to Brad, his behavior of leaving parties is negatively reinforced because he escapes something he dislikes. Brad's traits of anxiety and introversion are what we would call establishing operations because they increase the effectiveness of that reinforcement of leaving the party that he dislikes. However, ingesting alcohol might be an abolishing operation for the behavior of leaving the party because it decreases the effectiveness of the negative reinforcement. Brad feels less anxious after ingesting the alcohol. The party becomes less aversive, and Brad feels less motivation to escape it. Now, circling back to our student Norman, we can deduce that an abolishing operation is at play. Something in Norman's environment, likely the act of an adult offering him the options that he typically likes, decreases the effectiveness of the iPad time and cookies as reinforcers. It might be that Norman has an aversive, unpleasant relationship with many adult authority figures in his life, and pairing an adult authority figure with a normally preferred activity or item decreases its value to Norman. Activities or items that Norman typically doesn't prefer might temporarily become preferred because the adult doesn't want him to have them. This would be an establishing operation. Or the function of Norman's behavior may simply be to escape adult attention, which is aversive to him at that moment. Whew! That was a lot of learning in part 1. So we're on to part 2, what happens when we intervene to modify behavior. I promise it's much shorter than part 1. Let's reset. So we're looking at a student who, when faced with a particular setting events and antecedents, typically engages in an undesired behavior in order to access a functional, maintaining consequence. Remember the fire analogy we talked about earlier. When lighter fluid is present, if a match gets lit, student erupts with the big fire, and that leads to those delicious brats, a maintaining consequence. So our objective is to replace the undesired behavior with one that is desirable. We call this a replacement behavior. The easiest first step is to teach the student a functionally equivalent replacement behavior. In order to be functionally equivalent, the consequence for the behavior must be comparable to that of the behavior that we're replacing. It has to get the student the same thing that the undesired behavior did. For example, take a student who's repeatedly shouted at her teacher when math sheets are being passed out, because the student doesn't like math worksheets, and when she shouts at her teacher, she typically gets referred out of the classroom, therefore escaping an activity that she finds unpleasant. In order to replace this behavior, we could teach the student to request a break. So faced with the same triggering antecedent, i.e. the presentation of that non-preferred math worksheet activity, the student would instead request a break and leave the classroom with the teacher's permission. The student still escapes the aversive, unpleasant activity, but the behavior, requesting a break, is more desirable to those around her than what she was doing before, the shouting. Of course, we can't stop there. In this example, the teacher would likely not want the student to take a break every single time they need to complete math work for the rest of time. In order to intervene successfully, then, we need to teach the student to engage in a desired replacement behavior, which may or may not be functionally equivalent. For example, if working independently in class on the math worksheets is our desired behavior, we might reinforce it by providing the student with a sticker following every 10 minutes that she spends in class working on her math worksheets. So the function of that new desired behavior, working independently in class, is totally different, i.e. obtaining a desired item, the stickers, instead of avoiding a non-preferred activity, leaving class. We often work to promote functionally equivalent replacement behaviors and desired replacement behaviors at the same time. Functionally equivalent replacement behaviors are key because they are quick to establish and they meet the student's needs, while the more difficult process of teaching more complex skills and shifting the student's motivations occurs. See, now we're already on to part 3 of the video. We're going to build on what we just learned and talk about how we make that process happen, what we're actually doing. So those desired behaviors we've been talking about, they're really skills when you think about it. Using the right voice tone, controlling impulses, being patient, responding to emotions appropriately. Like any skill, we have to learn it. We have to acquire the basic knowledge, become fluent, and then we have to actually perform it when we need to and generalize it in a variety of situations. This is my favorite chart of all time. This is the chessboard, the basketball court, the football field. We're looking at the same chart we looked at before, but we've added 4 buckets of practices. 4 buckets that represent everything we do to support student behavior. Number 1, prevention. Number 2, teaching. Number 3, reinforcement. And number 4, response. Pick anything and you can divide it meaningfully into those 4 buckets and make sense of it. Classroom management. It's a bunch of techniques and strategies that can be easily sorted into those 4 buckets. PBIS, same deal. Responsive classroom, same deal. Every BSP you've ever seen, same deal. You get the idea. So let's start with prevention strategies. These are things that we do to make undesired behavior less likely to occur and desired behavior more likely to occur. They include changes to our instruction, our interaction strategies, the physical environment, etc. A few examples are greeting students, rotating around the classroom to vary your proximity, preparing engaging lesson plans, pre-correction prompts. So many examples of things that we do to set students up to be successful. Teaching is how we help students acquire and develop fluency in behavior skills. So in a controlled instructional setting, we tell students what a behavior skill does and doesn't look like. We help students to understand when it's needed and why it's important. We model the skill, for example, role plays, videos. We help students to practice, and then we provide feedback. There are many SEL curriculums out there, but a few that are very common in SCRED districts are the Second Step curriculum and our own Be Good People curriculum. Reinforcement strategies, which means we're either providing the student with something they prefer or taking away something that they consider aversive or unpleasant, are things we do after we see a desired behavior that make it more likely we'll see that behavior again. A few common examples are praise, token economies like point sheets, or providing direct access to a reinforcer, like an edible. Response strategies are things we do after we observe an undesired behavior that make it less likely we're going to see that behavior again. So they involve one or more of the following: neutralizing or withholding the reinforcement that a student would have otherwise received following the undesired behavior. An example of this is planned ignoring if the student would have otherwise obtained our attention. Taking away something the student prefers, for example, losing a privilege, or providing the student with something that they find aversive or unpleasant, for example, a corrective conversation with an adult. When used together, these 4 buckets of strategies amount to a collective push and pull effect that disrupts the old pattern of undesired behavior while encouraging the student to perform their replacement behavior skills. Prevention and teaching set them up to be successful, and then we jump in and reinforce when we see the behavior we want to see. On the other hand, if the undesired behavior rears its head, our response is like a dam that keeps the behavior from being reinforced. That mention of a dam reminds me of my favorite analogy for this process. It's like a river. The old pattern of behavior is the river flowing in a direction that's undesirable. And it's like we're digging a ditch that's going to make it much easier for the river to flow in a new direction. And at the same time, we're trying to dam the old path so that the river can't flow that way anymore. Before we go, I want to talk about a phrase you may have heard of before. Is this a can't do or a won't do problem? Does that sound familiar? Another version is this a skill or a will deficit? So this is similar to what we were talking about earlier when we said A, kids need to acquire and develop fluency in behavior skills via teaching, aka closing a can't do or a skill deficit, and B, kids need to perform and generalize their behavior skills, aka closing a won't do or a will deficit. So often the answer to this question is a little column A, a little column B. Let's talk about why. The flowchart we're looking at is designed to help schools match a student with appropriate behavior interventions. Again, we use teaching to support acquisition and fluency of skills that the student can't do, and that's the left half of the flowchart. And we also use prevention, reinforcement, and response strategies to support performance and generalization of skills the student won't do. These won't do strategies should be selected based on the function of the undesired behavior we're trying to replace. And that's the right half of the flowchart, is those behavior functions that determine what prevention, reinforcement, and response strategies we're going to use. After reviewing the flowchart, you may assume that a can't do or a won't do is a black and white distinction. We're either teaching or we're preventing, reinforcing, and responding, one side of the flowchart or the other. Now, for a single behavior skill, that might be true. But don't miss that dotted line in the middle of the chart that connects both sides. That dotted line is there because when you think about the big picture, we're typically trying to increase proficiency in multiple skills simultaneously, and each student's degree of proficiency is going to vary across those skills. So we can identify many behavior skills, both basic, prerequisite skills, and more advanced integrative skills. This results in a complicated web of relationships. With that in mind, an effective behavior intervention is often going to tackle both the can't do and the won't do by using all four elements that I've described: teaching, prevention, reinforcement, and response strategies, using all four in order to help a student learn and apply a variety of interdependent skills. This was a lot to digest. Thank you very much for your time and attention.